my name is Frank Voorhees. I'm the director of the African Wildlife Economy Institute at Stellenbosch University. And we're working in partnership with the Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation Unit to bring you this and future wildlife chats. So folks, please mute yourselves, and then as we can go in, we'll do the combination of putting messages in the chats and raising your hand. There's a place down in the bottom right when you can raise your hand when we get into discussions. So this is the third of 5 that we're putting in a series of fireside chats about the future of the wildlife economy in South Africa. And they come out of the high-level panel report that was released 2 months ago, and then the draft policy position that the minister released last month, which is open currently for comment. The first one was on transformation. The second one was on protected areas and the relationship between protected areas, the private sector and communities. And this one is on hunting. All 3 of these, if you will, are cross-species, integrated high-level discussions. The last 2 will look at 2 of the iconic species that were addressed by the panel. And in the policy, we'll have a session on Thursday on rhinos and then next Tuesday on lions. So this one, though, in some ways can be quite technical because we're looking at a hunting standard, is really part of a question of how does a hunting standard fit into a vision for where this economy can go. Can the wildlife economy be inclusive? Can it actually deliver conservation? Can it generate economic opportunities and so on? So we've got with us, oh, sorry, and I should say that the high-level panel recommended the standard, and the policy paper looks at how we can, if you will, improve the accountability in the sector, in the industry, in hunting, both for domestic reasons and for international reasons, so that South Africa can be seen as a premier place for people to come and enjoy wildlife economy opportunities, including hunting as a key and critical part of the wildlife economy. So we've got 3 principal guests with us today. If you could mute your mic, that'd be much appreciated. Phumeleni Kawamani, and I practice it, Kayamani, I really apologize. He was the chair of the South African Black Hunters and Sports Shooting Association. Phumeleni, your name is much easier than the person I work with from Eswatini, whose name I still can't pronounce because it's got too many N's and H's and L's in it. And so yours is much easier. And then we have Lizanne Nell, who's the Chief Conservation Officer at the South African Hunter and Game Conservation Association. And lastly, we've got, I think if he's on or he's coming on and back, is because of connections, is Richard Sawry, who's in the Kruger Park. He's the section ranger for the Kingfisher Spruit. And so what we'll do, like we did with the last 2 sessions, we'll start with having the 3, this time 3 principal guests say a few words, introduce themselves, and give their perspective on this issue of a standard for hunting in the broader context of the growth of the wildlife economy. And then we'll open it up to the rest of the guests on the call for a bit of back and forth questions through the chat box, comments to the chat box, and then using the hand raising, and we can call on a few of you. Shall we start with Phumeleni, and then on to Lizelle, and then on to Richard? Say a few words. Over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Frank, for that introduction. You know, you can call me Phumi. People call me Phumi, and I accept that.
Okay.
My colleagues call me Phumi. My name is Phumeleni Kayamani, and like you correctly said, I'm the chairman of SABASA NPC, which is Trading as South African Black Hunters and Sport Shooting Association. I'm also a member of quite a number of hunting organizations. I'm a member of SA Hunters for almost 10 years now. I'm a member of NetShoot, and also locally in Cape Town, I'm a member of a shooting club here. So I've been in hunting for a number of years. In fact, I've been hunting my whole life. but big game hunting, I started about 10 years ago or so. I also love on the side cattle, Nguni cattle specifically. So I'm an aspiring beef cattle farmer. I'm an ex-co member of the East Cape Nguni Club, which is the oldest cattle club, Nguni cattle club in the country, turned 32 last week. So yeah, that's basically the long and short of it. I was born in King Williamstown. I grew up there in Ginsberg. It's a township close to King Williamstown. That's where Steve Biko was born, if you know Steve Biko. But I moved to Cape Town about 20 years ago, 21 years ago, and I've been living in Cape Town for the past 21 years. SAPASA was founded in 2019. It's a fairly new hunting association. The association itself is new, but the people who are leading the association, they've been around for quite a number of years. So thank you once again for inviting me to this fireside chat. And I think I'm actually very positive about the report and what the report is recommending and all of those things. It's a monumental task. We are quite aware of a few things that we've been debating. A standard, yes, I'm for that. And there's something that the minister said in her statement on the 2nd of May, and I want to quote her when she was releasing the high-level panel report. She said, throughout the report, the focus is on providing policy certainty and reducing bureaucracy and red tape. Perhaps most admirable that the panel recognized that solution of the issues require bigger picture framing and a reimagining, if you will. So I think, you know, just to concur with what the minister said, we do need to reimagine the way we think about hunting and conservation and all of those things. Yeah, I think I'll stop here for now. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Lisanne, you were part of the panel, so you're part of the influence of getting us to where we are now in this discussion. So over to you to just briefly introduce yourself and make a few comments. I think you have to unmute. There you come.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Thanks for the introduction. And yes, I was a member of the panel, but the outcomes of that panel was the work of a group of people, not any one individual. And I think the report should be read in not by the letter of the word, but in almost like Pumi was saying, in the reimagining. And it's for us now to pave the way on how that's going to happen. As far as the hunting standard and certification systems are concerned, that is something that runs throughout the panel, dealing or making recommendations on wildlife certifications, a hunting protocol. But that's also linked in some cases, even in the same sentence, to issues like self-regulation and self-administration. Because if we want to move in the direction of growing the sector and we want greater self-administration and regulation, we need mechanisms and systems in place to actually assist us in taking that forward. Now, the wildlife sector in South Africa is really becoming more mature, and we've got very different product offerings on the market, whether it's from a hunting perspective, live sales, tourism, or even game meat. Together with this, on the consumer side, like hunters and tourists, perceptions are changing, and people have a need for specific products that they want. Now, all of this is influenced by changing perceptions about the need for greater environmental sustainability, and then also requirements of consumers in the value chain, including consumer countries like, for instance, the USA, that currently have a requirement for enhancement findings to allow import of certain hunting trophies into those countries. So, addition to that, we've got areas like the areas adjacent to Kruger, where there's people with different value looking at wildlife from a different value proposition perspective. And some of them are photographic safaris, some of them do hunting in those areas. And we need a mechanism to proactively address potential conflict between these different value propositions in an area where people use the same wildlife resource. And this is where sustainability certification systems and standards, and I use them all interchangeably for the purposes of this discussion, can really assist us. On the one hand, it can assist the producer level, which is the game farmer, for example, in making informed decisions on the type of products that producer want to make available to, for instance, hunters. On the other hand, the consumer can make an informed decision on where he wants to, what he wants to pay for in terms of products and experiences. So I think one should see things like certifications and protocols really in a proactive way in addressing challenges that can be addressed, and not necessarily as something that is just negative. In addition, there's been so much done in terms of certification processes and standards and guidelines. I'm sure all of you know that the IUCN has got a guideline on making or how can you see trophy hunting as being sustainable, and that addresses both it addresses economic issues, it addresses social issues as well as ecological issues. And I think that's the importance, again, of what the recommendations of the panel was pointing towards, that we have to start looking at, for instance, how hunting affects communities, the social aspects as well, which we haven't done so much in the past. I'm not going to speak too much about the protocols next to Kruger because Richard can speak to that. He's been personally involved in that. I just want to highlight a few other certification or standards processes currently going on in South Africa that has a link to the hunting sector. And I'm highlighting this because I think it's important for us to recognize that we can't look at hunting in isolation. We have to look at that in the entire value chain, from the wildlife areas right through to, in the case of meat, where meat is consumed. So there is a certification system currently receiving attention, a wildlife certification system. Roland Forwak from the department can talk to that. Then there's a tax incentive initiative from the Wilderness Foundation currently that looks at tax incentives for wild populations, or for instance, rhino and lion. And for government to make a decision on where to give incentives, they need a mechanism to make decisions. And this is also where standards and protocols come into play. Then as far as the game meat industry is concerned, or sector is concerned, there's a process for a national strategy. And once again, even with hunting, those that hunt for the purposes of meat is linked to this game meat strategy and standards and certification of game meat to make sure that it's safe for human consumption. And I think Sanette Olsen is also in the audience, and she can maybe talk to some of that. Then lastly, another example that I just want to use is in the case of Bontebok, there has been a crossbreeding between Blesbok and Bontebok. And there's now a system in place, or standard in place, that helps certify pure Bontebok populations. And it's not only a conservation protocol, because if you want to export hunting trophies from South Africa, there's a requirement to show that that hunting contributed to that specific population's future in terms of conservation. So even though it looks like a biodiversity or conservation protocol or standard, it also links to hunting trophies and the export of those, and helping us to demonstrate that hunting actually contributed to conservation. So I think with that few words, I'm going to hand over to you. Thanks, Frank.
Thank you, Lizanne. So Pumelani says we should reimagine, or the minister says, and he's quoting her, reimagine the sector. And you've already said it's going to be complex. There's a lot of angles that all have to be put together. But at least getting it all on the table, like you're saying, and looking at these different standards is a great start. Fabulous. Okay, Richard, just introduce yourself and say a few words from your perspective on this topic of a standard for hunting in the broader future of the wildlife economy.
Afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Frank. So I'm Richard Surrey. I've been a section ranger in Kruger National Park for 20 years in the Kingfisher Spruit area, which is around Auckland. And I've been really fortunate to be exposed to certain aspects of what you would call the wildlife game in terms of photographic concessions when Kruger developed them from scratch to where they are now 20 years later. So in other words, they developed the Sabi Sand model from scratch and really had to relook at that and rethink some of the impacts of that. So I've been involved with that for 20 years. So I have a really good understanding of the impact of the photographic safari industry. And then on my western side to the north, I have the Timavati Private Game Reserve and the APNR, the Associated Private Nature Reserve. So I've been involved with them for 20 years as well. And about 10 years ago, you know, I'll just say the heat on hunting started to increase. And I could see on the ground the effect of the economics, the social impacts of hunting was having from a positive perspective on the reserves, and I understood it, but I could also hear the anti-hunting fraternity, you know, shouting from the gallery. And we needed to the photographic concessions have a protocol called an operations protocol, and it basically describes how they go about what they do in order to generate the revenue, which then in turn gets spent on certain things. And we needed a similar sort of thing. Now, as far as I know, there's only 7 Kruger concessions, and the Kempiana Contractual National Park, where the Wildlife College and Ngala Game Reserve are based, they actually run these protocols where they look at all aspects of environmental or ecological sustainability, all aspects of social sustainability, and then obviously they're very concerned with running a good business model, so the economic sustainability is there. So we applied the same thing into our involvement in APNR. We don't tell them what to do, but because it's an open system, a lion can walk from Kruger into there and vice versa. So we had to manage our resources in a manner that was acceptable to photographic, to guys that didn't want the impacts of the photographic lodges and wanted to hunt. And then being under the spotlight continually, people will have heard of that lion that was called so-called Sky and all of those things. And I've sat at the coalface of all these things. So we started with the protocol that was about a 3-page document. And the intention of your protocol is actually to ensure what's going on the ground is what is desirable and having the desirable outputs. So you learn how to tweak certain aspects. And when you see something that's gone wrong, whether you want to call it a botched hunt or whatever you want to call it, you understand what took them down the road where it went wrong. Was it human capacitation? Was it not working together with other players in the area like the lodges? Was it that, you know, they were in too much of a hurry, actually not respecting the land and the animals? What was it? So we've been involved there for, it's about 15 years now. We're on to, I don't know what version of the hunting protocol, but it is a really robust document. It's been requested way afield in South Africa to apply to conservation and hunting areas, northern Mozambique and further afield. And yeah, it really goes about ensuring. So you had the hunting and the photographic, and they're just a dovetail of each other. But at their bottom line, you've got to ensure that land use remains wildlife, and that wildlife land use is the choice of the people. So you've got to have real good social sustainability. And that means that everyone buys into what you're up to. Got to have good, strong economic models. It's got to be valuable. So and in order to create value, there's this trade-off of devaluing wilderness. And that's the purest form of a wildlife area. And I'm fortunate enough to have a lot of those in Kruger Park, and I've seen them. And that is the purest form. And that's where we would all like to go and do a photographic safari, or if we're hunters, to hunt in those wildest areas. But obviously there's this trade-off. So that balance of how much you dewild the wildlife and dewild the habitat in order to achieve your economic outcomes and maintain land use wildlife is critical. And that kind of is what these protocols are all about. So I'm very optimistic, as Pumi said, about what the minister her intentions are with reimagining our wildlife estate. I do think in terms of our resource use, we've overshot the mark in South Africa. We've got very successful economic models. The ownership of wildlife is key to that. But we need a little clean house a little bit. By no means devaluing the wildlife or the wildland. In fact, giving it real value, because ultimately the inherent value in wildlife is the wildness of place and the wildness of animals, because no one aspires to see a lion in a zoo or hunt a lion in a zoo. And it's those sort of basic things that we've got to go back to. So that's in a nutshell, Frank. I could probably talk for half the day, but yeah. So for the last 5 years, I've been presenting a lot on what we're terming responsible resource use. So what really is conservation? How rational is animal rights? And I will not call it animal rightism, because it's not. I'm an animal rightist. I fight for the rights of animals every day. So's Pumi, so's Lazan, so's everyone on this group probably. Those people are animal rights extremists, and their approach is irrational, because the problem is 7.8 billion humans. And it's in that context we got to go and reimagine South Africa's wildlife economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Really, really interesting. It seems as if you've got on-the-ground experience happening there in the greater Kruger area on elements of what could go into a standard. Your protocol gives pieces of the solution, I think. So one of the concerns that's very strong in the report, and hunting is a piece of this concern, is the international reputation of the country. And as you know, there's a lot of people now that have moved away from hunting. They see hunting bad. A lot of people will say, how can you talk about conservation if you're going to shoot animals? That can't be conservation. So at the same time that what you need to do on the ground is to connect the dots of conservation, the use, whether it's tourism or hunting, and socioeconomic empowerment, inclusion, and so on. Can that effort improve South Africa's reputation, or how can it improve it? So how do you see moving forward South Africa being able to be seen as a destination for responsible, inclusive, sustainable, pro-conservation hunting? Pumi, you want to give your perspective on that?
Yes, Frank, I guess, we have all heard and seen what the anti-hunting groups have done. And I also want to say in the beginning that we are also partly blamed for that as the hunting industry. And I'm saying this on purpose because I'm reading something on the side chat. And while you were talking, it got me thinking, if we're saying, because South Africa has a very rich history of hunting. It's got established institutions in terms of hunting and nature conservation. But what message are we sending out there as the hunting community to the world? Because it's all about perceptions. It's all about what we're sending. When we say to people that be careful when you post things on social media and how you do that, I mean, that's just one area. And also, what value do we put in hunting? There's a question here that we cannot avoid. I know maybe we're going to get to this. We cannot avoid the training certification of 10 days. Now, what I want to ask ourselves is that, is 10 days or is that qualification sufficient for someone to be given a qualification as a professional hunter? So as if to say, we are not taking ourselves seriously. And just 3 days ago, an EXCO member, our youngest EXCO member, came to us and said, look, I'm a professional hunter. I said, hey, because he doesn't even own a rifle and he still needs a lot of experience to be a professional hunter. I said, well, when did this happen? You know, and all of, he said, no, I've got a certificate, you know, these 10 days certificate. So it is there, the perception that the message that we're sending out to we have to be very careful as the industry. We need to speak with one voice. And I think in terms of that, also it gets sometimes to, it takes us away from what we need to focus on, because the industry has done a lot in terms of showing the world, you know, that hunting is conservation. And I always say to my colleagues that I don't know if we'll ever win that fight, or should we focus on the anti-hunties, or should we focus on ourselves? Because we have a lot to do. I don't know if we have time to focus on that. Yeah, that's my contribution for now. Thanks so much, Frank.
Okay, great. Well, Richard's put the comment in the chat about the certification. Actually, I was on Richard's website before this talk looking at the PH story, because that's another piece of what is already de facto standards in the industry. And is it good enough? Is it robust enough? And it's something that requires further review and discussion. So there are elements of a hunting professional standard certification already in place, of which the professional hunting qualification is one of them. And of course, then can we up it? Can we make it a better qualification? 𝐿𝐳𝐴N, how do we build the reputation globally? What do we need to do to put South Africa on the map as the place to hunt in a social, environmental, and economically responsible way?
I think developing a protocol and these standards is one of the ways to actually get there. But it's important when we do that, like I think the two other guests have mentioned, we have to address all aspects, not just hunting, social and economic issues. And I believe we have to reposition hunting within the broader sustainable development agenda. You can't look at any wildlife-based activity without looking at full cost accounting, whether it's tourism or whether it's hunting or whether you have a filling station. With the pressure on the environment globally, we have to be more responsible and show that we are responsible in whatever impact we have in terms of the environment. So if we can start doing that and communicate that properly, I think that's one of our big challenges as a sector. We do not communicate well. We often have all of the information, but when people ask us, we are very shy in actually putting the information forward. And the other aspect is that we're not communicating always in a way that other people understand. And we keep on pushing the I have the right to hunt agenda, but not necessarily talk about the broader value propositions. We can demonstrate in South Africa how we contribute to the economy, about changing people's lives. We can demonstrate that, but if I ask you now, show me the data, it's not there. So I believe that if we start with this protocol system and with that proper collection of data, we will be able to show people that in how we construct the protocol, we address all of the relevant issues, but we also generate the information to support that. And I believe that that will actually take us forward. And I think we have to acknowledge that there's a certain sector of society that we will never convince, no matter what we do. We should ignore them and not keep trying to argue and fight them. We have to look at broader society. And I think people are in general reasonable. And if we provide them with the relevant information, we might actually see some change.
So thank you, 𝐿𝐳𝐴N. There's two themes that I see coming out at the moment now. One is the sort of economic case for it, the socio-economic development case. And what Richard had talked about earlier, the demand, the desire for the hunting and tourism to take place in a wilderness environment and the importance of wilderness. And in that one, I think there is let me to the wilderness, and I want to come back to the economic issue, but the wilderness, in the economic case, the wilderness issue, one of the things that's interesting, I find, I do a lot of work around the continent through the African Leadership University, is that Africans around the continent think South Africa is completely fenced from Rosebank to Kruger. The whole country lives behind fences. When I talk about wilderness in Africa, they go, that's not real wilderness. We've got wilderness in Tanzania. But to what extent is wilderness really a driver? Is it important as part of the equation for South Africa to actually maintain these landscapes? Richard, I want to ask you, because you've just made the case for it. Pume, for example, how do you see wilderness playing into this? Hunting, tourism in a wilderness environment, and part of the reimagining of the industry is, if you will, rewilding to a greater extent than the sector is at the moment.
Thanks again, Frank. That's what we're aspiring to do. I mean, we have, it would be nice, you know, to hunt in these areas. And like you said, I was actually smiling when you said, you know, up in Africa, something that, you know, South Africa is fenced and we're hunting behind the fences and all of that. But that's what we want to do. And that is part of conservation. There is an article that was written by a young lady. Her name is Nomusa Moyo. I think it was in June 2020. You may have seen the article where she talks about these things and where she's passionate. She is a conservation biology master's student at the University of Cape Town. She's also an aspiring ornithologist. Now, she said there, and this is now all part of the wildlife. And I want to read from, you know, what she said, because I went through this article again last night. And she's asking questions and she's saying, why is conservation action yielding results in America and Europe far better than in Africa? And where there is far greater opportunity, more protected land, more wildlife, more funds poured into projects. Other continents have real conservation wins, from species coming back from the brink of extinction to polluted river systems being restored and attitudes of people changing. I think that the attitude, the word for me, and I think Lizanne also alluded to it, it's the attitude, it's changing people's attitude. It's going forward with one voice, and we need that. I mean, we need that in South Africa. We need it in the hunting space, because she was also asking a question that, I mean, she's saying, there are a few exceptions, you know, where we have wins, and places where there are a few places where this is changing, and she went on to say, not much has changed in terms of conservation. It's still it has been not much has changed since the colonial times, when parks were fortresses to protect nature from the Black communities that had lived with it in harmony for centuries. The status quo cannot persist because it begs the question, who are we conserving Africa for if the majority is not part of an interest or interested in the solution? And that, for me, we are not going to get to that wildness that we want if we're not moving forward. There are a lot of things that we can do, Frank. Like I said, this discussion can go on and on. I thought about it, you know, I was actually looking at a whole lot of things, and we also, you know, have issues like the provincial ordinances which do not speak to each other. There's quite a lot to look into. Thank you so much, Frank.
Okay, thank you, Pumla. Very interesting. Changing attitudes is something we're going to have to unpack, understand where it's coming from, and then how to address it. It's not easy. Stephen, I see you've got your hand up, but I want to ask Richard a quick question, and I'll come to you about the economic and social side. Richard, Lizanne talked about data, and I know it was 2 or 3 years ago that somebody at Timbavati put out a couple pages on the returns on hunting versus ecotourism. It was a little piece, small, but it was making the case that the big revenues in the reserve was on the hunting side. There was just a fact. Now, it was an interesting article, but there was one of very few analyses that seemed to be out there in the public unpacking what are the returns of hunting. The other thing the article I don't think really addressed was how were those returns distributed? What's the social impact? What type of job creation is happening? What type of inclusion? Who's hunting? What's the profile of the hunter, and so on? Are you tracking in the part of the world you're working in there, in Kruger and Greater Kruger, these economic and social impacts of the industry?
Yeah, thanks, Frank. Yeah, we've been starting to track, because it's important to be able to illustrate what are the real impacts of it. But I do want to say this right up, so straight up, is that, you know, it's often said by, I'm a wildlife manager and a conservationist, and I'm not going to be supporting hunting or photographic lodges, one or the other. I'm supporting responsible resource use. So ultimately, having watched it for 20 odd years, I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt, it's not whether you're doing one or the other, it's how you're doing it. So ultimately, the amount of revenue that gets generated is dependent on two factors. Firstly, if you're doing it all wisely from a business perspective, then it's dependent on the amount of resources that you are consuming. You do not generate revenue without the consumption of resource. So the photographic safari industry and that side of tourism consumes water, and they sell water to guests, and that's how they generate revenue. No water, no guests. The other side of it would be the hunting sector, and that is mostly represented in South Africa in the more remote areas that are not easily accessible, that are drier, and they generate it by utilizing an animal to generate the revenue. But how much you do is that. But when that article was written, the APNR reserves were not, they were not optimizing their photographic side of things. And since then, they've asked a tourism levy. So in other words, if I must put it simply, the photographic tourists were getting their thrills cheap, and the hunters were paying top dollar for their activities. So it was not quite equitably, the pressure was not equal. So in the last couple of years, you asked the question, where's the revenue being generated and where's it going to? So we've started to ask in the last few years, where's the revenue from hunting being spent? Now, it must be, that same question must be asked of the photographic sector. So if I was to walk into a big developed reserve where there was no hunting, I would ask that question, where's your revenue generator being going? And you may find a lot of it ends up offshore, building, as I call it, simply beachfront cottages in Plettenberg Bay. But then you're going to see a large portion of it coming back into reserve management. So that is ultimately very important. If we're going to call this sustainable, you've got to be putting revenue back into sustaining the environment and the resources that you're dependent upon. So in terms of monitoring your water resources, managing your animals, and with that, the big burden of this day and age is the anti-poaching costs if you've got rhinos. So in the APNR, on average, it's about 60% of the revenue from hunting alone goes to security costs just towards looking after rhinos. And they're not really hunting rhinos. There's one hunted every few years, and it's generally a very old bull that is getting a lot of social pressure from other bulls and is going to be killed imminently. So a wise decision is made to hunt that animal. But 60% there, then about another 20–25% on wildlife management. So that would be issues associated with erosion, like road management.
There's a webinar on.
And then 15%, it's up now to about 15% on social outreach, community development, and those sort of things. So, you know, if we can drop what we need to spend on the anti-poaching, it means we can now spend more on communities. So when communities are buying into wildlife and the people, and that's all of society, that's from someone living in Cape Town to someone living next in the park, when they buy into your land use of wildlife, then they realize they win from the wildlife rather than, hell, let's just make hay while the sun shines out of the wildlife and exploit it. then we've got a sustainable model going. So we would ideally like to, going forward, and this is important, for rhinos particularly, we need to make a live rhino worth more than a dead rhino. Because people living in the communities, he is worried about his next meal. Where does dinner come from? And I don't think anyone on this webinar this afternoon is thinking, do you think I'll get dinner tonight? But that's the reality of people living in these areas adjacent to these reserves. So we need to change that to say, a live rhino is worth more than a dead rhino. We're absolutely going to be part of stopping the threat on them. Therefore, the reserve doesn't need to spend so much on that. The conservation costs, wildlife management will stay pretty much the same. And then we can spend more on community development and those sort of things. But, you know, it's really, are you achieving top dollar for your animal when you're going to hunt it, or the water you're selling to your guests? What are you spending it on? And are you utilizing those resources sustainably? So don't let anyone kid you. In the finest photographic reserves in our country, there is a quota of animals. It's not put out as we intend to harvest, but there's a quota of animals that are harvested every year under the auspices of problem animal control, because the humans and them, there's conflict. So one guy once said to me, you know, when I worked in that reserve, what I had to destroy in the name of problem animal control was almost as much as I'm hunting as a quota to generate revenue this year. So, and that's the reality of it. So you've got to go and unpack what is your resource use in totality, and then manage from there. Thanks.
Thank you, Richard. That's I think you're ending on the right point there of unpacked it in totality. It's land use and the various things we're doing on the land. And one of those is hunting, which we're talking about here. Richard Ferguson earlier talked about the standard. We've also had a bit of chat in the side about the term trophy hunting and whether that's appropriate. Stephen, you want to raise a point, and maybe you could also address, should we use the conservation hunting term they use in Namibia, or what? Over to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Frank. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to start with the earlier opening statements about the reputational harm that apparently South Africa's had that needs to be restored. And that's a peculiar ongoing myth, in my opinion, in the last 6 years or so. And it certainly it came to a head at the time of the so-called Lion Colloquium that was held in our last parliament, where a bunch of really rabid anti-use people managed to hijack our committee and get a 2-day colloquium on the lion issue there, all based on the reputational damage. The truth of the matter is the reputational damage is only fed by a very small and narrow group of highly focused troublemakers. No mainstream conservation organization was creating reputational damage for our hunting scenario in South Africa. That was all emanating from the anti-use brigade. Sadly, they also played their card very right and managed to find a few allies from within the hunting fraternity in South Africa who joined them to beat the drum on the lion issue in particular. And that gave them impetus that they should never have received from within the hunting sector. But that's an internal, I think, economic or self-interest driven issue that did occur here. It was a perfect storm that came about. You would have also heard that a lot of those same antagonists made a huge noise against captive lion breeding, for example. And I know we'll deal with lion in the next week or so, but it's themed to the reputation of hunting. They made the biggest noise about the captive lion issue, but they kept on raising the names of Cecil and Sky, neither of which were captive. So the drum beating was a complete bull dust. And unfortunately, very much fed from within certain minor elements of the hunting sector. Now, the reality is that there's 20 million hectares of private ownership ranch land in South Africa, the vast majority of it fenced to a greater or lesser degree, and almost all of it has been perfectly well viable both economically and sustainably for decades already, grown by people who are doing the job properly and marketing themselves and didn't need any of the help from any of the latter-day white knights that have ridden in to save this industry. This industry doesn't need saving from from outside. It's capable of saving itself without the non-hunting yet very actively involved scientists and geniuses and officials and everybody else that wants to come and solve a problem that really doesn't exist. The problem simply exists because government don't know how to create an enabling environment. They want to come and interfere at the micro level. And there are other individuals here who want a piece of the action. That's where the reputational issues are coming from.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. That's a very interesting perspective. I think one can look at this in two ways. One is that there is already reputational damage, or isn't there? And I think you've made the case that the damage isn't as great as it is now. And the other is the risk going forward. And sitting where I sit, which is actually in Oxford in the United Kingdom, there is a huge and palpable movement to stop hunting here domestically, every type of hunting, lots of discussion about it. And what I read the minister saying is that, quote, it's part of the South African heritage and culture, and we have to have activities that promote best practice and transparency. So it's more of a risk mitigation approach that I see it, and I think that could be very healthy. So as there is concern about hunting, can South Africa step up to the game and be best of class? So I see the call myself as an opportunity, but you're indeed right. There is a very strong group of people that are out there that don't like the industry at the moment, but there is a general trend. I look at the trend against meat consumption, what have you, let alone wild meat consumption that we see around the world. So yes, it's something we have to address. Okay, who else do we have here? I have data. Yes, data is very important. Richard again says there's a lack of data. I think we found that last 2 weeks too. We don't have good data yet on the whole sector, the wildlife sector. And following on Stephen's point too, even good data of what's happening in the international markets, who's coming, what their profile is, what they're looking for, and so on. As much as I like Richard's approach to say, well, we really want the wilderness experience. Do we have data to back that up? Or are hunters just happy to shoot anything in a backyard? Are they happy just to, I doubt that, but can we get that type of evidence? I think that's something we really have to take it seriously here, that if we want to get a more inclusive approach, we have to understand what's happening now in socioeconomic and conservation terms. Which leads me to another question, which I think I'm going to throw back to Lisanne, which is the One Health bit of this whole discussion. There's a new vision of a One Health, and to what extent do you see a standard in hunting addressing the animal safety, animal rights, animal welfare issue that is also another one like concerns about hunting that is an increasing issue, and a concern that how this industry actually operates from the viewpoint of animal welfare?
Thank you, Frank. I think when many hunters hear the word welfare and considering welfare issues, they immediately sort of get concerned. While I think, the fact that we, especially in SA hunters, we make a huge effort of allowing opportunities for our members to improve their shot placement, for instance. So killing an animal with one shot is part of animal welfare. You don't want the animal to suffer. So I believe we have to address those considerations, and we're already doing that in a certain extent. And I think the fact that we sit with COVID and the implications thereof shows the implications of this or the approach to this one welfare approach. Especially with globalization and people moving between countries and so on, we are part of the environment. We're not separate from that. And we have to, in what we do, have to understand that intricate relationship between people, wildlife, and the environment. So how we do that, that is going to be a challenge. I don't think it's going to be so easy. But we have to sit around the table and find solutions to address those. going forward, because it's not going to go away. And the animal rights groups are already starting to use some of these wildlife diseases to try and add to their arguments to kill hunting. But yeah, South Africans have been resourceful and innovative. So I believe when we sit around the table and we start discussing these issues, we will come up with something that works for us, and we shouldn't be led by all of the international noise. South Africa should take the lead. And if you look at a lot of the data around species and populations in Africa, we have done exceptionally well in terms of species not going extinct like we've seen in Europe and America. But it requires for us to sit around the table and talk and listen to one another, and accept that going forward we will have to be more responsible, even in terms of animal welfare aspects. It doesn't mean it's going to rule and regulate everything that we do, but it's part and parcel of what we do already. We just have to expand that.
Okay, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's this one health theme that's in this one welfare type theme that's coming across is to me, it's part of sort of the SDG approach of connecting the dots between the environmental, social, and economic aspects of that. I will say though, Lisanne, that it's very good for South Africa to get its act together, but in order to be best of class, it has to be looking at the rest of the world and bouncing its position back, addressing with the folks that are out there, some of them that have misconceptions, some of them that are looking at this from particular angles and so on. So it's a complex game we're in, for sure. Gerhard, can I ask you to intervene? I see your hand is raised. Gerhard? Did I say my Afrikaans is worse than my culture? Hi, Gerhard.
That's fine, Frank. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot also for the opportunity. I think there's a lot of truth being said this afternoon, but I think it's also important to say a few things. And I think we must take one step back and go back to the biodiversity lab, the outcome. And we must remember some things that we said there that is very important to take us forward. The first thing I believe, we must still keep the competitive edge with animals that we can still hunt in South Africa. And if we struggle to clarify certain things around certain species like lion hunting and lions, I think we must look seriously into this to get a plan and put a plan on the table to take us forward, and not necessarily to say stop everything. I think that would be the wrong approach. Also for what we do concerning hunting. That's just an example that I mentioned. And you can go to leopards, and you can also go to elephant and the iconic species. We all know that there's a lot of people on social media, especially and people from Europe, that's not really connected to the environment anymore. That's saying a lot of things nowadays. But I think we must give a little bit more credit to wildlife ranching also in South Africa that's happening outside of the protected areas. And unfortunately, we must all admit that we haven't done enough to do that proper marketing. And also out of the biodiversity lab, we can also say one of the outcomes is there must be better marketing. Also from government side. To market it better, that we're busy with and that we do. Everything is not always that bad. Unfortunately, if 3 or 4 or 5% is doing things wrong, then the perception out there is that it's a 90%. And rightfully also said by Richard, there's 7 billion people, there's a lot of people, but that will not go away. Africa will be in the next 30 years, there will be 1 billion people more. So the big thing is for us, we must look at the biodiversity framework in South Africa, and I think we must look at the private sector and how we can ride the private sector into the biodiversity framework. We're not there at the moment. And there's not a good perception necessarily on certain things that the private sector is doing, but I think we need to change that. And the last thing I want to say, or the second last thing I want to say, we must also relook all the other things like the TOPS regulations, and also that Lizaan also said about the Bontebok management, the biodiversity Bontebok management plan. How we present this also to the world, also as a private sector, but because at the moment, if you look at TOPS regulations, it's not working for the private sector, so we're not going anywhere at this stage. We must rethink that one as well. And then also, what's very important that we must always remember of what we're busy with, and I'm talking now specifically the private sector, not the protected areas, is trade will save these animals and not aid. And that's what we believe, and that's what we do every day. There must be a fine balance. And if we remember that one, I think it will go well. Thanks a lot, Frank.
Thank you, Howard. Very interesting comment, and also bringing in the marketing side and the role of the government. I mean, governments do play a very important role, whether we like it or not, in marketing our products for the private sector. You can think of the work that the Department of Agriculture has done over the years to export products out of South Africa. Here in Oxford, we drink plenty of South African wine, I can tell you, and it gets in here. We don't have much South African biltong, and we'd love to have some here, but it's not in here. So maybe part of this pulling these pieces together is also to bring a unified voice in the hunting industry and in the wildlife renting industry that can work with the department and with the minister to develop a better image for the country and to increase exports, to increase its ability to market its products overseas. We've only got a couple minutes left, but I thought I'll give each of our principal guests a minute to wrap up. But just to comment, what's come out of this one I find amazing, and some very good comments in the chats too, is the amount of research that needs to be done in this area to understand how these standards actually, what's actually in place now, how we can build on them, whether it's the hunting standard, whether it's the standards being developed for wildlife ranching, the metrics, the numbers, the accounting for inclusion, for economic development, the impact on conservation, the importance of wilderness. Oh my, there's a huge list here. And so here at the African Wildlife Economy Institute, we're very happy to be partnering with Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation to actually try to develop a think tank that will work on this, if you will, to work on the business of conservation, the wildlife economy, and to start looking at these socio and economic dimensions of the industry we're in. So one of the things I've got out of this session is a lot of work to be done and a lot of exciting opportunities to engage researchers in this topic and to hopefully unpack this a lot more. So can we have a minute each? Pumla, starting with you. Final thoughts,
Frank.
comments?
Thank you so much once again. Frank, I want to say that as an association, as the South African Black Hunters and Sports Shooting Association, the people that we, and this is going to link up again with what we said, because the whole thing is about economic inclusion, it's about wildlife economy and all of those things. And in our submission to the high level panel, because we had given them practical examples, because we do think that there are things that we can do now, things that cannot wait. And to do those things, again, we need political will, because we said we want to bring everyone on board, but not everyone on board has the know-how. We always say, you know, Richard said earlier on, the people that are poaching, they're looking for a meal. You know, where is the next meal going to come from? But you get two types of poachers. You get the organized crime, you know, the rhino poachers, and then you get people that want meat. They just want protein. That's what they do. But when they go into your farm, they're not going to choose between a springbok or I want to find a springbok, let's say, and I want to find a much more expensive animal, a swart vetpens. What is that one again? But anyway, never mind the name. So you get those two types of pouches. And now we said we have offered practical solutions. And then we said you have communities that live around these farms where they're looking for meat. But when they go into your farm, they don't select whether I'm going to it's all about meat to them. And the disconnect that is there is that there is no interaction or engagement a lot of the times. And this is what we find between the farmers and the communities that live around the area. For instance, in our submission to the high-level panel, we made proposition, practical proposition that, for instance, in Goedemoed prison in Bloemfontein, you have a prison there, a government prison that's over 1,000 hectares, but only a portion of the land is used for prison. The rest, it's full of game that is worth millions of rands, eland, kudu, you name it. And you know what they're doing with it right now at the moment? The prison warders are hunting the game and then they sell it to themselves. Those are the facilities that we can use to train communities, to turn them into something that can make money, right. For the communities. We can train them there about the animal, about everything that we need. That is a government. That's why I said political will. We gave them another one, Kerwood Prison. And this is land and game that is there that could be used to train and benefit the communities that live close to these are just, it's not complicated.
That's
Thank
fabulous.
You so much. I wish we had more time. Thanks so much, Frank.
Well, we'll definitely have to talk again. That's absolutely fabulous. And I loved your examples. I mean, poachers are hunters that just need to be formalized and brought into a proper system. And there's resources potentially in areas where you can do that, proper training, proper awareness raising, and so on. Lisanne and Richard, we're over time, but a minute each from each of you. Lisanne?
Thanks, Frank. Yes, I just want to say that, conclude with the fact that I think all of us have to become and demonstrate greater sustainability in whatever it is that we are doing. And that means we have to look at social aspects, economic aspects, and environmental or ecological aspects. If we start developing standards and certification systems that can help us demonstrate this sustainability and this responsibility, it will go a long way in communicating the contribution that we do make, which we struggle with at the moment because we do not have sufficient data. Further, I do believe that having these standards proactively help us address some of the challenges and the conflicts proactively. It helps us to protect the wildlife sector and especially the role of the private sector in all of this. We haven't spoken much about that, but the private sector plays a huge role. But from a private sector perspective and a government sector perspective, we need to know what the rules of the game is. And I think in many cases, we do not know what that is insofar as hunting is concerned, insofar as breeding is concerned. And this can help us actually moving forward insofar as understanding the rules of the game and then communicating the wins to society out there. Thank you.
Exactly, Lisanne. And I think the call from your report, the HLP report, and from the proposal is to actually establish those rules, responsible, inclusive rules, and do that in a multi-stakeholder way. Last word, Richard. Sorry, just a couple seconds.
Thank you. I think as society, we need to connect more with our environment, and we need to really understand where our clothing and our food and all of that comes from. Go and look at your land use where your lentils come from, and go and look at your land use where your feedlot meat comes from. And we really need to start to understand that more. And then my last word is, everyone on this platform needs to go and look up the word regenerative, because ultimately it all comes from the habitat, the soil, and the plants. And we're not spending enough time looking at that, because without healthy soils and healthy plants and water tables and the rest of it, we're not going to have healthy animal populations. And that will reflect directly on us because we are connected to the environment. And I think,
thank you, Richard.
We can end there.
Okay, regenerative conservation. Fabulous point to end on. Thank you, everybody. That was an absolutely wonderful session. I learned a lot, and I can see we have a lot of homework, but it was great to see all three of our principal guests looking at ways to not to close the hunting industry, but to actually build the hunting industry, make it more inclusive, make it more responsible and accountable. Fascinating session. Okay, next session, we talk about rhinos, same time on Thursday. Cheers, everybody.